Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Myah and this is Inspired by Myah. So today I'm going to be making some combat / cargo trousers, which I've been wanting to make for the longest, but I just never had the right tools and equipment, like the fabric. I've got the correct fabric now. I've brought like all the little rivets, what do you call it, rivets, but like the jean buttons and the rivets, yeah, you know, the little things that you get on jeans sometimes, the little metal things. I brought all the equipment that I need to do that because I want to make these good and proper. But now that I've got everything and I got a clear mind, I'm ready to start this project. So I started with making my technical flat in Adobe Illustrator. Now I like to do my designs digitally rather than hand drawn, just because I feel like my drawing skills are just not up there anymore and it's so time consuming. I'd rather just have a digital copy which then I can use and apply it to like loads of different things. So when I'm doing my technical flat, I like to, it just helps me like get the idea out of my head and it makes it easier for me to make little design changes. So for the cargos, the idea that I wanted is obviously for them to be baggy. That's just what I imagine cargos to be. I don't really like the tapered ones too much. So I wanted them to be loose fitting. I definitely wanted pockets. Like, what are cargos without pockets? I know that I needed a zipper fly on the front, and I knew that I wanted loads of top stitching because I don't know, cargos just give off big utility vibes and I love it. I love top stitching and all the little details. So once I established like that was in my mind, I put it onto Adobe Illustrator and started to design it. So I decided to put 2 pockets on the side of the legs. I would have done 1, but because of my height I thought 2 might look better because I do have quite long legs, so I didn't want like 1 pocket up at the top and then the rest of the legs just bare. So I put 2. I also did some side pockets near the waistband just because, you know, I think it looks good rather than it being plain on cargos. And then I also added some back pockets which have little flaps on them. So once I decided on all that, I added in some seams as well. I decided to make the legs split, so the front of the pant and the back of the pant on the pattern, it will be in 2 separate pieces. I did this so that I can obviously make a seam and do like all the fancy top stitching details, which just looks so good. I also decided that I want the waistband to be a bit thicker than your traditional. Usually waistbands are like 3.5 to 4 centimeters, but I made this one about 5 to 5.5 centimeters, I think. And I also decided on a chunky hem. I didn't want a skinny thin hem. I wanted it to be chunky because that also weighs down the fabric and I think it just makes the trouser drop a bit better. But yeah, I plotted all of that in Adobe Illustrator, and once I was happy with it, I moved on to applying those changes to my basic blocks. So I used that design to adjust my basic block. For my measurements, I did take my measurements again, but I also took measurements of clothing that fits me how I want the cargos to fit me. So for example, these pants, which you can't see that I'm wearing, they're quite baggy and it just has that fit that I think a cargo pant should have. So I took those measurements and applied it to my basic block, and now I finished the pattern and I'm ready to sample it. So I've got my pattern here all ready to assemble. Literally, this is the worst bit ever. One day I'm going to get one of those big printers that just print it all for you at once, but for now we're living with the A4 life. If you do want to purchase this pattern, it will be available on my Etsy page and the link will be in the description box down below. But without further ado, let's get into it.
5 months later.
So in today's video, I'm going to be making these long-awaited cargos. If you do keep up with my 1 or 2 random Instagram posts, you'll know that I've been working on these cargos for a while. Like, I'm talking 2022. We're in 2023 now, February, 2 months in, and I still ain't got no cargos in my hand because I've come to the realization that I'm just a procrastinator. I've just developed this thing, like I'm just scared to sew. I'm scared to cut up my real fabric and make mistakes, but you know, I have to accept that that's what it's all about. That's what sewing is. You learn what to do and what not to do. I have to make the mistakes to show you guys, you know what I mean? So that's why it's taken me so long. And I think it's definitely a case of like trying to reach perfection And I know that it's not always possible, but because I release my patterns on Etsy, like I want them to be proper. I ain't trying to release no shabby work. Like I need you guys to know that there's levels. Do you know what I mean? Like, so yeah, that's why it's just so hard sometimes. But I'm trying to overcome this. I feel like I've got the fit of the pant is how I want it to be now, and I think that I'm ready to start the real thing. I'm just gonna choose which fabric I'm gonna use. But yeah, I hope that you guys enjoy this tutorial and that you learned something from it. So yeah, let's get into it. So after many samples, I finally plucked the courage to cut my real fabric, and honestly when I got to it, it wasn't that bad. The fabric I used was a beige nude cotton twill. I laid my pattern pieces on and then cut around the section of the fabric I'd need so I could iron the creases out before cutting. Hey. Once I did that, I used tailor's chalk to trace around my pieces, mark any notches and then cut them all out. I'd say this took me about an hour and 30 minutes, which is quite long, minus the music segments. The first bit of preparation I chose to do was the pockets and flaps. So you want to mark your seam allowance with tailor's chalk on the right side. Try and do it faintly so that you can see enough, but it isn't hard to remove. On my pattern, I added 2 centimeters to the top of the pocket and 1 centimeter all around. So I marked that, ironed the top, and then took it to my overlocker to seal the edges. Then I continued ironing the rest of the edges. You want to do this for the 6 pockets. I'm using 2 different threads for this project, a normal cotton thread and a denim top stitching thread. I'll show you how this makes all the difference in a bit, but you want to change your thread to top stitching thread and adjust your stitch settings. I made my stitch length longer so it stands out, then just stitch the hem of the pocket in place. I forgot to mention that I changed my needle to a denim needle because I'm working with twill, which can get quite thick when sewing through the layers of pockets, so make sure you have a suitable needle on your machine. For the flaps, again, you should have 6, so that's 12 pieces in total, and you want to place them right sides facing and do a stitch all around, leaving the length of one side untouched. Once you've sewn all 6, you want to snip the edges like this so that we can turn them out and get a sharp edge. I used my nails to push the corners out, but it might be useful to use a blunt sharp tool. After that, you want to press the flaps flat, and we're going to top stitch all around the edge and then do another stitch adjacent to that all around. I'm just showing you the difference between the normal thread and top stitching thread. It makes a huge difference to the outcome of your garment. It's a lot thicker and sits better on top of the fabric, whereas the normal thread almost gets swallowed into the stitch and you can't appreciate the beauty of the top stitching. Next, I just prepped my zipper fly guard by ironing it flat, overlocking around the outer edge, leaving the folded edge untouched. Then I decided to do some top stitching. I did 2 stitches on the folded edge using the top stitching thread, but I did forget to lengthen my stitch here. To begin assembling the pant legs, I laid my pattern pieces out in the correct way, right sides facing up so I don't get confused, and then I proceeded to overlock the edges, but not all of them. Make sure to leave the hem, hip pocket area of the front piece and the waist of the front and back untouched. A fast way to get through masses of overlocking is to not snip the thread after overlocking each piece, and instead just carry on sewing the next piece and then at the end snip all of the excess thread. Once that's done, we can start with the horizontal stitching. I just used a 1 centimeter seam allowance, normal thread, and ensured my pieces were matching up perfectly. Once all those seams were done, I took it to the iron and pressed it open first, and then I ironed the entire seam allowance towards the hem of the pant. Now change your thread to the top stitching thread and begin to top stitch. If you need to change your needle width, make sure you do so that we're catching the seam allowance underneath, and also for that prim and proper look, make sure that you lengthen your stitch. Once the seam allowance has been stitched in place, we want to do another top stitch next to the original seam line to complete the look, and also this adds some strength to the seam, making the garment more durable in the long run. Now that your horizontal stitching is complete, we can assemble the vertical seams with the same method, and we should have 4 pant leg pieces, 2 backs and 2 fronts. Don't be intimidated by hip pockets, I promise you they're super simple. First thing we need to do is take our pocket lining and sew it right sides facing the pant pocket edge. Make sure you change your thread back to the normal thread and your stitch settings need to be back at the normal seam settings. Now press the seam open so it lies flat and then iron it towards the pocket lining. Change your thread and settings to the top stitching mode and then sew the seam allowance to the pocket lining, not too far but not too close to the edge. Now iron the lining piece back to the back of the pant and iron it flat. Top stitch the front of the pant pocket edge. I sewed about 1 centimeter away from the edge and then did an edge stitch so that I have a double row of stitching. It would be useful to use a twin needle here to save time, but I didn't think of that at the time, and it would only work if you have 2 spools of the same thread. Once the top stitching is done, we can change back to our normal seam settings, then place the second pocket bag on top of the lining bag. Make sure the right side is facing the ground because this is the piece that will be visible on the front pocket of the pant. Now stitch around the whole pocket using your seam allowance, and then we're going to overlock the curved edge. Then attack the pocket in place at the waist and side seams so that it doesn't shift out of place. Now for the back pockets, the part that requires a lot of attentive and precise sewing skills, I placed my flap corners right sides facing down on the markings I made on my fabric when I was cutting the pattern out. Make sure the unsewn edge is pointing towards the hem. Pin the bottom in place and then place the pocket bag 1.5 centimeters down from the unsewn edge. Pin all the edges down and make sure there aren't any ripples in the fabric. Now do that for the other side of the pant and move to the sewing machine. Change your thread and settings to top stitch, and I started with the pockets and I did an edge stitch around the entire pocket except for the top. You will have to do a pivot stitch at the corners. And once that first stitch has secured the pocket in place, we can do the second stitch on the inside of the stitch we just did. I did mine about 1 centimeter away, again pivoting at the corners. After that, I stitched the flaps down about 1 centimeter away from the edge. I did trim the seam allowance down slightly since we will be top stitching the seam and I don't want any seam allowance peeking through. Also, to make sure this feature turns out as nice as it possibly can, you want to iron the flap down before top stitching it in place. Now we can put the side seams together with your normal thread and seam stitch settings. When I started sewing, I realised I needed to overlock the side seam of the hip pocket, so I had to stop in the middle of the seam and do that quickly before finishing the rest of the outer seam. Then just like the horizontal and vertical seams, iron the seam allowance open to make the seam lie flat, and then iron the entire seam allowance towards the back pant leg and do a double row of top stitching like we did on the previous seams. Again, we're repeating the same instructions as before with the back pockets. Just make sure that you place the pockets in the same place on both legs. On my pattern, I placed the flap edge about 1 centimeter away from the markings I made because I made a last minute decision. I just thought that it was too close to the hip pocket, but this has been adjusted on the final pattern. Oh my gosh, don't make the mistake I almost just made. Make sure that you pin it so that it's right sides facing down. Sorry, right now I've got it right sides facing up. You can tell because of the top stitching, so make sure you've got the right side touching the right side of the fabric. But again, I placed the pocket 1.5 centimeters below the flap and pinned all around. Repeat this for the other 3 pockets and flaps. Now the zipper fly is probably the most complicated feature on this pant. I've assembled it a bit different than usual and chosen the jean zipper fly, which involves more top stitching, but I think it definitely suits the vibe of cargo pants more. So first we need to overlock the curved side of the zipper fly and then place the straight edge right sides facing the crotch of the left front pant leg. If you're a male, do this on the right side. Now attach that with a straight stitch. Once that's done, iron the seam open to form a lovely finish and then iron the zipper fly towards the back of the pant leg. Next, top stitch all along the edge. Remember, a lot of these stitches we'll be making will be visible on the outside, so make sure you're taking it slow and steady for the best results, and once that's done it should look like this. Now here I trimmed into the other pant leg seam allowance. I actually did this step at the wrong point, but it didn't cause an issue, so I just snipped into the seam allowance where the zipper fly reaches the other side so that the bottom of the crotch area and the top would be separate, but I'll touch on this again a bit later. Now place the zipper right sides facing the zipper fly. make sure the top of the zipper tape reaches the top of the waist and then pin all the way down. Now change your presser foot to a zipper foot so that we can sew closer to the zip. Sew on the side furthest from the crotch seam with a straight stitch, and make sure you're only sewing the zip to the zipper fly and nothing else. Next we have to move the other leg of the zipper out of the way. You can do a hand tack stitch, but I just used a pin, although it can cause bulk and make it difficult to do the next step, which is top stitching the zipper fly shape. I forgot to record myself marking this in, but I just freehanded my shape and made sure to use a ruler so that my line was even and straight. You want to start from the top and work your way down to the curve. Then once you reach the edge of the fabric, do a pivot stitch and sew up about 0.6 centimeters, then do another pivot stitch and sew adjacent to the stitch we just made, going back up to the top of the pant. Please take your time with this step because it's so easy to mess up. A trick is to get your stitches to line up with something on the machine, like the edge of the presser foot, so that your width stays consistent. Now take your pin or tacking stitches out, and I forgot to record this bit, but here is where we will attach the zipper guard to the zip. So on the side that we just took the pin out from, you want to place the zipper guard right sides facing up and underneath the zip. The good side of the zip will be facing up and the overlocked edge will be on the edge of the zipper. Now just top stitch that in place. Now we can bring the two sides of the pant together. So remember those snips I made into the seam allowance earlier? Usually you would do that now, but I was ahead of the game. So we need to iron them. I just marked 1 centimeter in on the right side of my fabric and then ironed it towards the back following the markings so that I have a clean edge. Now bring that over to the other pant leg and pin it on top of the zipper all the way down, but leave the bottom of the crotch untouched for now. Sew with a top stitch, and this is what it should look like. Now we can overlap the crotch pieces by our seam allowance, which mine is 1 centimeter. Pin this in place and then do a top stitch from the bottom of the crotch upwards and then sew back down. And that's it, the zipper fly is complete. Now we can sew the centre back seam up. Just fold the pants in half and sew with a straight stitch. Afterwards, iron the seam open. There is no top stitching on this seam, but that is up to you to decide whether you want to do that or not. Now we can sew the crotch seam, and make sure you pin the centre of the crotch so that the seams line up. And sometimes pant legs have the tendency to become mismatched when we're sewing, so to avoid that I would suggest pinning them. And if you're not going to pin them like me, make sure you start sewing from the bottom of the leg and work your way up to the crotch. And if you're feeling extra cautious, stop stitching at the crotch and flip the pant so you can start to sew from the bottom of the pant leg for the other side again. I hope that makes sense. Then iron that seam out as best as you can. For the waistband, you want to sew the side seams with a straight stitch and normal thread, then press the seam open. Now pin the longer edge, which is the bottom of the waistband, to the waist of the pants, right sides facing, and do a straight stitch all around using your normal thread and seam stitch settings. Now take the other waistband piece and pin the top, which is the smaller edge, to the top of the waistband attached to the pant, right sides facing, and again sew all around with a straight stitch. Next, iron this seam open so it lies flat, then press all the seam allowance to the outer edge and do an understitch to keep the waistband from turning up. Once that's done, fold the waistband over so it's right sides facing the other half and sew the corners. Make sure this seam is straight, use a ruler if you have to. I also want to note that one side of the seam allowance will be left unfolded, and I only want you to sew up to the folded edge. Don't go any further because we need to tuck the excess in later, and that will be hard to do if it's tacked down. Next, trim the corner, not too close to the stitch, and flip it right sides facing out. Once that's done, take the pants to the iron and we're going to iron the seam allowance in place, ready for stitching. To make this job a whole lot easier, I decided to make use of hemming web. It's essentially just an ironable strip of glue. I folded my seam allowance in so that it reached a smidge below the seam line. I placed the hemming web in the middle and then ironed it in place. I can't tell you how much easier this makes sewing the waistband. Like, I would say having hemming web is an essential. It did take a while to iron it all in place, but once that's done, it makes sewing a breeze. To sew, I used top stitching thread and my top stitching stitch settings. I sewed on the right side of the fabric about 2 to 3 millimeter away from the seam line, and then I worked my way all around the waistband, pivot stitching at the corners. Now we can work on the buttonhole. I used a pin and tailor's chalk to mark where I want my button and buttonhole to go. And then, as always, made sure to do a sample on some scrap fabric before doing the real thing. But in my case, that didn't matter anyways. See, what the heck, man? Why has it got to do that? Why? These are the things that frustrate me. Like, I am trying to be so calm right now. I'm trying to hold back my tears because this whole project has just gone so smoothly, and especially after me like being so put off from doing it, and then something like this has to happen. Like, why, after I tested you, why you gotta give me problems? Like, I hope that my fabric is still in a decent condition because I might just cry. Okay, I somewhat got it out, but I'm so upset about that. Let me just trim off the back threads. But to do the buttonhole, I just attached my button foot, and it has an area where you place your button in so that it sews the correct length for your button automatically. Not all machines are the same, so you will have to find the method for your machine if it does buttonholes. Otherwise, just sew with a tight zigzag stitch in the shape of a skinny rectangle. So anyways, after that was resolved, I opened the buttonhole and double checked I was happy with my button marking, and I used my tool to attach the jean button. I always use Prim tools for this kind of thing because their products never fail. It was so easy to attach the jean button with the pliers and there were no hammers involved. For the belt loops, I cut a 4cm strip of fabric and used my bias binding maker to fold in the edges so I could top stitch them to make a strap. I did a double row of top stitching and then trimmed the straps down to the length I wanted my belt loops to be, and then pinned it to my pants on top of the waistband and slightly underneath the bottom of the waistband. Then just use your top stitching thread and stitch settings again to sew it in place. This can sometimes be a bit challenging because the fabric gets really thick at this point, so be careful. But that's it, the cargo are complete. I mean, here you would do the hemming as the final step, but I ended up liking how mine looked, so I kept the frayed hem. But now let's go on to the final reveal.
Perfect.